Greetings. My name is Michael Miller. This is a Michael Miller trademark training video out to you because you're watching. Thank you and welcome. It's meant for Michael Miller Pilates licensed affiliates, the Core New Core, and anyone interested in surviving and thriving as a Pilates instructor or student and student. We're all students, right? What have I learned? I don't know. What have I learned? Number 1 out of 4. The first one is techniques, identifications, and functions. The second one is be clear. The third one is exhaustive reps. And the fourth one is Walter Mitty, direct your thinking. Number 1. I got invited to some deal and responded that I couldn't make it, but hope someone would present or be aware of, or that it would be that CT and MMP would be included. And herein is part of referring to them as such. If they don't know what you're talking about, then immediately they don't know something that you do. You're using your shorthand to refer to, and if they're not interested, they don't care, and it won't matter. But when and if it does, and I explain then I'm talking about core new tension and the ideal within Joe's original work, I got a pleasant response back about when they had time, perhaps they might explore these techniques. So that's why in title number 1 is the word techniques, because I had someone use that word to refer to CT and MMP. And the point I would make to you is that the clearer you are on your own point of view, the less threatening you can be in representing your point of view, because all you do is try to reflect clarity, which is my number 2. You try to reflect clarity from your point of view that is the best that you can do, is to give a distinction, and whereupon technique was being applied to what I've considered to be identifications, regardless of whether I'm right or not, and what people mean by technique versus identification, any of that. Where am I going with that? What I wanted to share about distinctions that came to me was that in a technique, it is a way of doing something. In an identification, it's identifying the way something works. So there can be multiple techniques to accomplish an end. Let's say a technique I would think of as something you do to get to an end. It's a technique. And an identification is an understanding or an explanation of why the technique works that way, or why those techniques work. It's the way it works. See the difference? And of course, talking to myself, I say, no, Michael, you don't see that. You're lost in your own point of view. And that can be true. And aren't we all? We're limited to our own point of view. So my focus is on being clear in your point of view, so that you remain as clear as you can be. So that's number 2, be clear. Right? in what you understand as the way something works, not just a way of getting something done. Why does it work that way? What's behind it? The way it works. And so that brought me to the word function, because a teacher I admire, I admire all instructors of Pilates because it's such a noble undertaking. But this particular teacher, in a different language, from a different culture and a way different background, said, well, Michael, you're talking about Pilates as a function, in that you add this and this and this, and then you get that. Like the variables in an equation, and you plug in the variables, and you get the answer. So almost already that's way over my head. But insofar as trying to adapt what you hear from others, the clearer you are in the point of view that you're coming from, and to the extent you're willing to share that with someone, the variables you feed into to get the results of the equation, you feed in being, thinking, and observing. And when you get those connected, you get equals to, you get what the product of the function is, and that's the experience. Okay? So this is one point of view out of thousands. Right? It's a very specific point of view. It's ideal in nature. It's ideal in nature, from nature. Pilates is a response to the reality that we find ourselves in, and we do Pilates in our interest to survive and thrive within the circumstances we find ourselves in. That means being biologically embodied and trying to exist in a physical world that is no small task, right? It's a physics thing. So, what was my number 3? Be clear. To me, in my point of view, core nutention is an identification of the way something works. And then it can inspire all kinds of techniques about engaging in core nutention or finding it as a sensation. So I'm trying to point out that you know your point of view, not to be competitive with others, just to be clear in your interaction with others. Where you're coming from in your point of view, so that they can establish in their simulation, right, some sense of where you're coming from. And within MMP, you're coming from an ideal, so hopefully across all of your other interaction in Pilates or about Pilates, there can be some consistency of where you're coming from, because you're connected to the ideal. And that's the ideal, I think, to the extent that it is, or if it is, see, to the extent that if there is an ideal, it protects itself. Which is what I encourage you to recognize and embrace, or at least stand close to, Because if you stand close to what's ideal, that, you know, a guy like me can point to, which means not, you know, just anybody can point to, because it's all there in Joe's book. You just have to read between the lines. And so, number 3, exhaustive reps. Exhaustive reps. So, I see on social media somebody in doing lateral flexion, perpendicular to vertical, which means they're on a short box with a one leg hooked under, going sideways, and a magic circle held behind the hands, and it's a guy, and it's a video of narrow range of motion and high repetitions, like exhaustive reps in a narrow range. And that makes me think of the buildup of lactic acid as a consequence of doing that. And that's what sort of Joe wrote about not wanting in terms of an effect. So one of the characteristics that I would think about Pilates is that it's not high reps. It's not meant to be done to exhaustion because, why? Because of the response of a lactic acid buildup. You go read his book, see what you think. Number four. Oh, before I leave that comment on exhaustive reps, see, there's an example of other kinds of training, just other kinds, not worse, not better, but other kinds of training being applied to or on or with Pilates equipment. And the more you know about the nature of Pilates, the clearer you can see lack of understanding or lack of awareness, or just an intentional commingling of the instructor's whim, right? We're all instructors, and we all have that creativity and responsibility in the moment to meet that moment. The more you take a person out into longer range of movement, to listening more to what's going on and adapting to being to participation in the corrective loop. And as long as you're not being paid to be the instructor, you don't need to voice where you go or what you do with that student or the movement that you see there. But knowing what you know from your own point of view, right, gives you clarity in the movement that you inspire. So number 4, Walter Mitty, direct your thinking. So unless I'm mistaken, Walter Mitty is that fictional character who daydreams and gets lost in adventure in his head through the monotony and boredom of his existence, evidently some kind of thing like that. But to me, a contrast to directing your thinking is where you get lost in daydreaming where your thinking just goes its own way and thinks about whatever it wishes. And that's nice, but I think in general in nature, that tends to end up in a decreasing spiral of what you end up entertaining in your mind. If you let your mind lead or thinking. Direct your thinking means there's a difference between daydreaming and directed thought. And to the extent that time is precious, and especially in a 55-minute session with a student who needs to have as much as, you only have so much time. And in recognizing one's line of thinking, if it's a line of thinking and has no value until you choose your values. And in the process of not just daydreaming, you direct your thinking, and in directing it, I think you implicitly, by your choices, choose values. I'm trying to say, let the values that you choose inspire you. I'm sure that's way too. But direct your thinking, and as a Pilates instructor, you direct your thinking about how you're willing to think about what Pilates is and how you're willing to think about who you are as an instructor. And it's complicated, and it's personal, and it's sacred to all of us. As a Pilates instructor, now, in terms of being the instructor and seeking the coordination of the capacities in the human being, of being, thinking, and observing, it's not like their capacities in each have to match, and don't, right? I don't think. But the nature of their character has to participate. It has to be a participation. It has to be a coordination. Not just of one or two, but of all three. And it's in the MMP, it's in the MMP interpretation of spirit as observing, that you get to looking at yourself as an instructor who helps your student coordinate those capacities, or you try to, and in those moments when you do, right, you get a gold star without actually moving that way, because you're connecting, you're delivering what they're there for, whether they know it or not, which is that coordination of their capabilities. I'm not sure how to distinguish between capacities and capabilities. So in my summary on this, in terms of techniques, and having people, that person, whomever, interpret you in the world from which they are running their simulation, that will always happen, right? What I'm encouraging is that the clearer you are and where you're coming from and how you see things, that's the best you can hope for within your interaction, other than, of course, having what you see from them, and how you see it within your world. Right? Know what you know. And be grateful for when you spill your tea on your phone that's already cracked and has gaping holes in the glass and goes berserk, that it dries out and I'm able to actually still broadcast today. Thank you for watching. MMP explains why. MMP explains why. Now, if that's a technique, see, is that really a technique, or is that an understanding of how it works? How it works. You understand why it is, and in understanding why it is what it is, well, I think it all feeds off of the experience. Because all of us, many of us, have an experience, and we seek to go deeper in the experience and apply more control, have a deeper understanding of it, have a closer connection to it, right? It is its own magnet. What makes MMP unique is that it explains why Pilates is what it is, which of course assumes that it is something that is explainable. And a lot of the views of Pilates are not interested, do not care, or look at it in a way that's just other than MMP. And that again is my point. I want you to be clear in the identification of two things: core new tension. And that's not just a technique, it's an awareness of the way it works, the way the biomechanics works in the body. And all of your technique is how you interact with your student to empower them to be able to engage in that tension, is the word I want to say, in core new tension, to be able to make rotational dynamic in their bodies and to hook it up to others in their bodies. And I think to all of us, understanding why it is what it is only matters to a point. Just get out of the way and let me enjoy myself in what I'm doing as a student, or especially as a teacher. Some generation will come along who's has a larger population of wanting to understand why. And it's those curious about why. It's those curious about why that you will be ready to offer the explanation that you picked up from yours truly. Best I could while I could, knowing that life can't live forever, and read between the lines and see behind the curtain, evaluate perspectives, points of view, know what you know, and then direct your thinking, and always, Geist,